football team. And about 3 weeks into the season, they said, you know what, that's really good. That's really good. But what we're actually going to be doing is playing football. Is that about the way it feels to you as you settle in?
It's actually, that's a great analogy. And I'd say a couple things. One is I'm a cancer guy. My whole life, I'm a cancer guy. However, I came to a place that had incredible depth in virology. And Todd, you and I spoke when I first got here, and I talked about the role that we've played in HIV and the reason we were in viruses. So the reason the Hutch has been in viruses is because viruses drive about a third of all human cancer. And if you look at the people who are long-term survivors of viral disease, cancer is one of the most common causes of death. So the commitment to cancer has been in the genes of the Hutch for years. The commitment to virology has been in the genes of the Hutch for years. So because we had so many people working on viruses, to be able to focus specifically on COVID was very natural and something that our faculty found pretty easy to do. For example, right now, we have more than 55 faculty members working on projects directly related to COVID.
Yeah, it's really a great point. A lot of people don't know or didn't know previously that the Hutch has an infectious disease division. And because of that, your scientists were really at the forefront of what was happening here. And it was almost an early warning system for Seattle via you. There was a great Fortune article that appeared in April about you realizing, based on the early warning from some of your researchers in that division, that COVID-19 was going to be significant. Can you walk us through the realization that you had and how it has reshaped your first 3 or 4 months on the job?
So Todd, that's a great question. And I think one of the things I'd say about that is what it taught me a lot about Seattle, a lot about why I think this city is so great and has such incredible potential. So the first early warning, as you point out, was brought to me by Trevor Bedford and Steve Pergham. Trevor was and is an investigator with the Seattle Flu Study. Now, what is the Seattle Flu Study? Seattle Flu Study was funded and supported by the Gates Foundation. It was organized through something called the Brotman Beatty Institute, which actually is sponsored by the Fred Hutch, the University of Washington, and Seattle Children's. So you've got 5 of the great institutions in this town working together on the Seattle Flu Study. And what Trevor's a genomic epidemiologist, and what he was able to do was rapidly pivot from working on influenza to working on another respiratory disease, which is COVID. And he was able to figure out that this virus was in the United States, that we had, it was in Puget Sound, and that we had community transmission. And I remember meeting with Trevor and Steve. Steve is the head of infection control at the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. And they sat down, and Trevor and Steve said to us, guys, this is going to be a real problem for us, not only in Puget Sound, but throughout the entire country. And that really caught our attention at the end of February.
And you upended the entire Hutch board meeting that was set for the next morning.
Next morning, I was meeting with my board, and I said, guys, we're going to have to change everything here. We're going to have to call an audible, and using your sports analogy. And the play we had isn't necessarily going to be the play we're going to run right now. But I think, Todd, one thing that's really important to not forget is cancer is still incredibly important. Patients and families of patients with cancer, or those who are going to get cancer in the next year, they're counting on us to come through with breakthroughs in treatments in cancer. And so I just want people to know that while we're doing a tremendous amount in COVID, we are still incredibly devoted to working on cancer and finding treatments that will make a difference there.
Well, how do you do that, though? Because like many other companies and institutions, a lot of your researchers, up until just recently, I understand, have been working at home. You just now have started allowing, on a minimal basis, 1 researcher per bay, as I understand it, researchers to come back. How do you pursue that core mission when you've basically been sidelined for 3 months?
So, Todd, I think one of the key things is we're using a scientific, data-driven process to bring people back. Okay. Now, what have we been doing for the first 2 months of this, first 6 to 8 weeks of this process, or 9 weeks? Those who can do research remotely have been doing research remotely. Not necessarily, not everyone loves that. For some, it works out better. For some, it's harder. But that's almost half the research that's done at the Hutch theoretically can be done remotely. People who are doing bioinformatics, people who are doing public health, people who are doing what we call dry bench research. Much of that, not all, much of that can be done from home. So we've allowed people who are working remotely to work remotely. That's about half. We encouraged everyone working on COVID to come into the labs and work with 6 feet of separation, mask, gloves, et cetera, and frequent surface cleaning to keep a safe environment. And once we saw that within the Puget Sound area that the number of cases began to come down, we began gradually dialing up the number of investigators in the laboratories. And now we're up to 1 per bay. We started with just 1 per room and 1 per lab, and now we're up to 1 per bay, which is basically a space that a researcher does experiments on. And at the same time, based on an incredibly generous donation from the Bezos family, we are supporting a study to look at testing of people as we bring them back. So antibody testing, immune profiling, as well as virus testing, PCR-based virus testing, to be able to see, can we determine, are there signals that tell us it's safe, signals that tell us it might not be, and we're using that to guide bringing people back. Our strong hope is we'll have everybody back within the next month.
Wow, everybody back.
Everybody back who's doing laboratory research. People working remotely, we're going to continue to dial those people back, but it's going to be a little bit slower, because there you got questions of, we have to all be careful. If we have people who can work remotely, they should, because it reduces the number of people using public transport, number of people out in the public that can possibly transmit community-based virus.
Now, that testing that you're going to be doing in the employee base, could that be considered representative of the population to the extent that others could learn from it?
So it's being done as a clinical, that's a great question, Todd. It's being done as a clinical trial so that we're going to be able to publish the results and people can learn from it. Now, remember, every sample has some bias to it. Okay. So every sample of people, whether they're people who work at the Hutch or people who present in labor at a hospital in New York City, or people who are randomly selected, all these groups have some bias to who gets tested, who decides to join the study, who gets tested. So it will be representative of the people who work at the Hutch, and it might give us some signals that can help other employers. But I think you always have to be cautious in terms of looking at any one study. That's why looking at the broad amount of data, the totality of the data, I think becomes so important. We're not only doing that study with our employees. Julie McElrath, who runs our vaccine and infectious disease division, is also doing a trial in first responders in the city, firemen, policemen, people who work as EMTs, along with doctors and nurses from Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. We're testing some of these people as well to see if again, immune profile, antibodies, virus testing as well. So I think there'll be a lot of places for data.
Would you feel comfortable as the president of an organization or a company bringing people back without testing?
Well, I think there are some circumstances where you can bring people back without testing. For example, if we know with time, as we follow the data that the King County Public Health Department in the state is gathering, and we're seeing that the amount of transmission in the community is low, there are some circumstances where symptom screening and adequate masking, gloves, cleaning of surfaces, when possible, that might be okay. And we still don't know yet how testing will ultimately be used. For example, I saw today an article looking at using a CRISPR based test to screen people before they get on an airplane. Now you're putting people in a small enclosed space, might make sense to do something like that. Or the people who are working in the fruit packing plants in Yakima, or the meat packing plants in Montana and in the Dakotas, there it really might make sense to have a very rapid return test that you can screen everybody in the morning before they start their shift, so that you can reduce spread within that environment. So I think we're going to see in different environments, different testing strategies work out. I don't think we're doing enough testing. I don't think we still have enough capacity to do testing. And I think it's going to be something which we're going to need to work together to get better at.
What are going to be the keys there? Because that is something that a lot of people are watching. You have a front row seat to that in some ways. What is your hope? The governor has said he wants to see 20 to 30,000 tests available to be able to get to the level where we can return to work safely. Are we getting to that point?
So a couple things we're getting to that point. We're getting better. Okay. We're not all the way there, but we're getting better. We need to make sure that there are swabs and that there are test kits, and that there's viral media, and that there are laboratories that can run the tests. And then ultimately, we need a breakthrough in the kind of design of tests. We need a test that's very relatively fast. One of the best tests, one of the most reliable, one of the most precise tests is a urine pregnancy test. We need something as simple and as accurate as a urine pregnancy test, which will make a big difference in how we approach this. If we had something like that, you could screen people before they went to the state T-Mobile Park to see the Mariners, and you could screen people on the way in, and you would know that it was safe for 40,000 people to root for the Mariners there. So those are the kinds of things technologically that we hope we can see those kind of breakthroughs. We're not quite there yet.
Yeah, I'm going to refrain from commenting on the prospects for the Mariners drawing 40,000 people, regardless of any pandemic.
Okay.
But we'll move on from that. So, I recognize that as we alluded to at the beginning, I mean, you're not a virologist; you are a cancer researcher.
Yeah.
So this is not your realm. But I would like to hear, even from your perspective of having fresh eyes on the situation. Clearly, as the Fortune article made clear, Seattle's response was unusual and remarkable. As you look at the national response and management of this pandemic, what are the specific things that you wish we as a country would have done differently and better?
I think it's really hard to look back and Monday morning quarterback completely. I'd say a few things. I'd like to say, as we go forward, how can we correct some of the problems we might have made?
It's very constructive of you. Go ahead.
Biggest thing I would say is the idea of we need to trust science. Okay, we need to have trust in science and technology, and we've got to be able to trust what our studies tell us and what our experts tell us. And one of the interesting things, I saw a study today in Axios where they looked at the blue-red divide on trusting science, and there isn't that much of a difference. Republicans and Democrats trust science and doctors pretty high rate. There's a slight difference, but it's not the same kind of difference you see on most topics. So it struck me that we've got to use that trust in science and that trust in data to help drive decision-making, okay? And I think that that's going to be really important, Todd, as we get the country back to work. There's absolutely no doubt that we can't stay closed forever, as Dr. Fauci says. If we stay closed forever, the economic ruin, the pain in terms of job loss and food insecurity will be something that will be extremely difficult on the country. So we've got to get it back, but we've got to do it as safely as we possibly can, and we've got to follow data to get there. Same thing with vaccination and vaccines. There's a lot of promising leads we've seen in the past couple of days about vaccine trials, but they're very early. So we need to trust the science to interpret what we have right now, but not over-interpret and claim that we've reached this completely. I think I'd love to see all of our decision makers making decisions that are science-driven and not driven by politics or other considerations.
That does not seem to be happening.
It doesn't seem to be happening, but it's also human nature as well. So I think it's a challenging time for people in that setting.
What have you learned about the Seattle tech community through the process of going through this pandemic? Satya Nadella, the Microsoft CEO, is on your board. The chair of the board is Matt McElwain from Madrona Venture Group. We talked about this when we first had a conversation. There you had your initial impressions coming in. What have you learned since?
So I think that, as I said in the beginning, really incredibly impressed with the Seattle community in general. A couple things. One, people work together really well. Now, maybe I'm just seeing this in light of a catastrophe where people will come together. But my gosh, am I impressed at how easily Microsoft and Amazon are sharing information and talking about best practices and thinking about how we can work together to do things that could make a difference. So I think that's important. I think this is a dynamic community. I think there's a lot of people who look at problems and say, hey, let's think of an innovative way to go at that. I mean, we look at the company Adaptive, which is one of the companies that came out of the Hutch, and we look at the fact that that they're also thinking about ways of using their immune profiling abilities to make a difference in COVID. And we look at a number of the places in the city where you see this intersection between tech and biotech. And that's something I think we need to see more of with time. One of the things I'd love to see come out of the Allen Institute and the Hutch and the UW and the place in Seattle Children's and the places doing science in Seattle are the creation of more of these companies that are on that interface between tech and bio, and I think that offers promise for the future.
Is there potential that that could be a silver lining here, that we see more of those companies coming out at the intersection of tech and life sciences?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a silver lining from COVID. I do think that there are some other silver linings for COVID. I think the rapidity of information sharing is going to be a big silver lining for COVID. The fact that investigators are getting their data. Look at the way Trevor's communicating. In the past, the way someone like Trevor would communicate would only be through papers in established epidemiology journals. Now Trevor's main way of communicating is on his Twitter feed. And so he's getting science out there. Most scientists now are putting their most important work in preprint form out really quickly. The New England Journal is publishing COVID papers a day or two after they get them with full peer review in that period of time. So this idea that the barriers that said, oh, it's going to be 8 months to publish something, that has gone away. And I think we've become much better at information sharing.
You said plural silver linings. Are there any others?
I think the other ways, practically from a workforce standpoint, I'd say half of my people who are working remotely think it's absolutely horrible and can't wait to get back. Another half have said, you know what? There's no commute. I can pick my kids up from school. I can do some errands in between Zoom calls. I think we're going to see that there are going to be a certain number of people who will find that a remote work environment kind of makes sense for them. So I look at that as another silver lining, and maybe we don't need as many office buildings, and maybe we can get by with different ways of working. I do think the biggest thing we will miss in that way of working is there's still a need for personal connection. The connection we get over a Zoom call is not the same thing. The last time you interviewed me, I know it was an audio interview, but we were face to face in the same room, and the connection you get face to face in the same room is different than a Zoom call.
Satya Nadella, one of your board members, had a very interesting commentary about this, and he talked about the 5 minutes after the meeting when you find out essentially what's really going on, and you don't get that in a Zoom setting or a Teams setting.
Well, it's also the personal connections. Yeah. It's the personal connections you make on those 5 minutes before and the 5 minutes after. The connections you make when you go out to dinner and have a meal with someone. And talk about non-work things, talk about their family, talk about what motivates them, talk about what they're afraid of and happy about.
Yeah. So when we did speak in February, you outlined a 4-point plan: immunotherapy and expanding immunotherapy from blood cancers to solid tumors, precision oncology, this idea of tailoring treatments to the specific genetic profile of a person or the disease, viruses and infectious disease. Boy, that was prescient. And the intersection of tech, data, and science. Those were the 4 points. That was actually very, very good at predicting what was coming, even though we didn't really know. What have your first 3 months been like, and how have they changed that plan and vision, big picture?
So I would say, Todd, those first 4 points are still just as important. Okay. In fact, 2 of them turned out to be crucial. But I also think that our commitment at the Hutch to immunotherapy, incredibly important. And we've learned new things in immunotherapy just in the past 3 months. I have to say that clinical trials for immunotherapy have been a little bit more difficult to do in light of a new virus that's being out there, because what we don't know is what that intersection between immune stimulants to fight cancer, does that help in the fight against COVID? There's some data that suggests it hurts in the fight against COVID. So there are some complications that we have to look at in terms of that. But anything that we do to understand the immune system, both cellular immunity and antibody mediated immunity and innate immunity, all of those different elements will help with COVID, as well as give us insights into what can help with cancer. And so a commitment to immuno-oncology and cellular-based therapies is at the heart of what we're doing at the Hutch. Incredibly important.
And we have some folks in our audience who are cancer survivors, members of GeekWire, who were very interested in your take on cancer. So I think it's worth drilling down into this. Why is that immunotherapy so promising when you talk about its expansion beyond the places where it's seen success so far?
Well, it's seen success in the kind of treatments, the hematologic malignancies, kidney cancer, and some lung cancers, and melanoma probably being the best example, Jimmy Carter being the best example of a solid tumor. But what we want to see is, what about the real common solid tumors? Most of lung cancer, all of breast cancer, all of colon cancer, prostate cancer, the cancers that hit 60% of the people who get cancer get one of those 4 big cancers. And what we'd like to see is, can we use these same breakthroughs in immunotherapy, be them antibody-based T-cell stimulators or cellular-based? And as I said, I think I might have said this back in February, more than half the trials we're doing at the Hutch and the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance using cellular-based therapies are for patients with solid tumors, trying to push the envelope in that area.
So what is the impact of the inability to do some clinical trials, and how do you get around that?
So the impact, I think we're learning, gosh, the public is learning more about clinical research than they ever thought they would know in terms of a phase 1 versus a phase 2 versus a phase 3, because they're watching the development of all the COVID therapeutics. And what I think people understand is you really can't cut corners. You need phase 1 to see, is a drug safe to give to patients. You need phase 2 to see, is there a hint of efficacy? And you need phase 3 to find out, how does this compare to classical therapy? So there's no doubt that something like COVID that slows down accrual to clinical trials will slow down the development of new immunotherapies. I can't imagine any way that's not going to happen. Our job at the Hutch is to make sure it doesn't get slowed down unacceptably, and to just make sure it's slowed down by a matter of months and not a matter of years.
In your time there at the Hutch so far, is there anything that you've seen that was new to you that made you say, wow, this is a game changer in the realm of cancer? I didn't know this was happening before. It's happening now. We've got to double down on this.
Yeah, so I'd say a couple of things. One is obviously the virology work. Okay, so I mean, I think the work in COVID, the incredible flexibility, nimbleness of our virus teams to rapidly pivot was something I was extremely impressed by. That's number one. Number two, we have an incredible group of outcome researchers at the Hutch, led by a guy named Scott Ramsey. And what Scott has, which I had never seen any place in the country before, he has data on cancer outcomes throughout the entire state: cost, survival, side effects, the whole state, every cancer patient in the state of Washington, where he can look at. What a powerful tool for quality improvement. What an incredible way to generate best practices and make sure and to look and monitor, are we doing better this year in treating cancer in the state of Washington than we were last year? And how can we learn from each other? That was a real aha moment as well. And then finally, the third thing would be just this depth of what's happening in these solid tumor T-cell trials, that we have a lot of work. And that's not just at the Hutch, that's also at the University of Washington and Seattle Children's. And all of us are part of something called the Cancer Consortium, which is our NCI grant that we do together.
Could you envision virology, infectious disease, becoming as important to the Fred Hutch as cancer?
So Todd, that's a great point. I feel strongly about this. I think virology needs a cancer centers program. Okay. One of the things that's given us the kind of focus we have for cancer is you've got 44 comprehensive cancer centers across the country that work on epidemiology, treatment, etiology, science, behavioral. We need the same thing in virology, because guess what's going to happen? In 2 years, we're going to be over COVID. We're going to be through COVID, but there's going to be another coronavirus. 5 years later, there's going to be another Ebola-like virus. There'll be more retroviruses. The viruses will be with us as long as humanity is around. And we need the ability to rapidly respond. We need people who are always working on viral epidemiology, not just doing it at the time of COVID. People who are working on platforms so that we can make vaccines quickly. Remember, the Moderna vaccine, the RNA-based vaccine, has never been shown to be beneficial in patients. If this one is shown to be beneficial, that becomes a platform. J&J has one as well. That becomes a platform that we can use to make other vaccines down the road. Small molecule scaffolds that we can use as antiviral drugs like remdesivir and drugs like that. We need to have that sort of thing. So, and I also think that the model for viral infections, it's okay for biotech. It's not incredible for big pharma. It needs to come from academia. So places like the Hutch and University of Washington, Seattle Children's, we need to be doing this together in a coordinated way. The way we have 44 cancer centers, we need to have a series of viral centers all over the country.
Well, why not spin off your infectious disease division into one?
Well, that's what we're doing. Okay. So, I mean, first of all, we have the makings of that. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's, I'll give you an example. One of the things we're doing, we're building a clinical trials unit for the treatment of COVID patients in the outpatient setting. So I was really impressed with the remdesivir data. It's early and it's modest at this point, but it showed a reduction in the number of days of infection. And it was done in patients who were incredibly ill, all of which were hospitalized, many of us were in the ICU. Well, you can't expect a drug to perform its best in the ICU. You want to give drugs to patients at diagnosis. Well, at diagnosis, patients aren't in the hospital. So where are they going to go to get a clinical trial in that setting? They need an outpatient clinical trials center. And that's one of the things we're building right now at the Hutch. We're converting some extra space into an outpatient clinical trial center. Now, what's interesting about viruses, unlike cancers, is this will be fine for COVID, but we don't know where the next virus is going to start. It might be China. It could be Puget Sound. It might be Santiago, Chile. And we've got to have that ability, and I hate to use the word pop-up, but I guess in Seattle you can because Amazon has pop-up stores. We would need to have pop-up clinical trial sites for doing therapeutic clinical trials in those areas. So I think a lot of the lessons and I'm looking at this as a cancer guy, I think a lot of the lessons of the cancer centers can impact how we think about viruses.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but I think you're saying that you need standalone centers.
No, I think
Okay.
actually, why not use the cancer centers as a backbone? I think
Got
that a place like the Hutch has incredible depth in both. There are actually a couple other places. Johns Hopkins has great depth in both. Harvard has great depth in both. So there are places, but I think that the model of that cross-spectrum integration, everything from epidemiology, behavior modification, drug treatment, vaccines, all of that needs to be covered at these centers.
Got it. Just a reminder, if you're listening and taking part in the webinar, you can submit questions for Dr. Thomas Lynch, the president of Fred Hutch, using the Q&A option down at the bottom of the Zoom panel. Dr. Lynch, I know how you've been spending the majority of your time. My sources have let me know that you're meeting daily with most of your senior vice presidents, administrative leaders on one topic. Do you want to let folks know what that one topic is?
Masks?
No.
No.
Money.
Money. The budget. Oh, yeah. Okay, exactly. Right.
No. Sorry, I was a little too obtuse there, but yes.
We are spending a lot of time on masks, if you can believe it.
Yes.
Okay. But no, the budget's a huge issue for us. And you saw last week that our colleagues at the University of Washington made a big announcement. Our budget cycle is a little bit different. We're right in the middle of looking at what the challenges will be for an academic cancer center for next year.
So what are the practical implications? Obviously, the Hutch gets funding from the National Institutes of Health, philanthropy. Just this week, the Obliteride bike ride was essentially broken up into a bunch of pop-up bike rides, if you will.
Yes.
Can you walk us through the different sources of funding and the impact on the Hutch from each?
Most cancer centers are supported by the grants to support the research, and I think that's a pretty good basis of support. I don't think that's going to have too much challenge. Philanthropy is incredibly important. Clinical revenue from taking care of patients, doing trials, that's also an important source of revenue for cancer centers. And there are reasons to think that all of these might have some challenge to them. I think that we won't be able to do events. We're going to have to come up with a different way of doing it. I think the bad news is there will be challenges. The good news is that the Seattle community has a very strong culture of giving. And that's been something that we've been very fortunate to be a recipient of. And I hope that University of Washington and Children's and Kaiser and Swedish also are able to benefit from the benefactors who've helped these hospitals. I think all of our healthcare institutions are going to have challenges because many of the things that we did in healthcare that generate margins we're not able to do. The elective surgeries, the elective scans, CAT scans weren't done during this time period. So we're going to have to make that up and see where we go from there.
What are you telling employees about the possibilities of cuts related to funding issues down the road?
So I think what we're telling people is exactly where we are, which is we're right now in the process of looking at what the numbers look like, working with our financial teams to determine what is the future likely to be in terms of what we can do. And then as soon as we've reached decisions, announcing those. We have not reached any decisions about what next year is going to look like. But we have an extraordinary employee base. We have an extraordinary facility at the Hutch, and we have to do everything we can to try to make sure that we're able to meet our mission. And our mission being the eradication of suffering from cancer, viral diseases, and other important human diseases. And we're going to keep a mission focus to every single financial decision that's made.
Got it. I'm going to bring in Monica Nicholsberg, my colleague, GeekWire's civic editor, who's been monitoring the incoming questions. And I know there are a few for Dr. Lynch.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Todd. And thanks, Dr. Lynch, for doing this. So we've got a few different questions, both from folks who are tuned in right now and from some of our readers outside of the webinar. We'll kick it off with Dave Cook, who's a good friend of GeekWire's. He wants to know, has the Hutch learned anything yet about community transmission among their employees as they return to work?
So what we can tell you is that community transition is real. It's happening in Seattle. What we can tell you is that the amount of community transmission in Puget Sound, King County, I should say, has been lower than it was. And that's probably a slightly better number than the number at just the Hutch. But if you look at the number of cases that get reported on the King County Health website, you see that the King County cases are coming down, which indicates less community transmission. Now, that doesn't mean zero community transmission. And I think when you look at some of the things we've been doing, what's made the biggest difference? Big fan of masks, okay? I think masks have turned out to make a bigger difference than we imagined they might in the very beginning. So I think one of the things we want to go into the summer thinking about is using masks. When I go running, I run with a mask. And when if there's no one around, I'll bring the mask down a little bit. If I'm going up a really steep hill, I'll bring the mask down a little bit. But if there's people around, I bring the mask up so that none of my breathing will get to them and less of their breathing can get to me. So I'm a big believer that masks are going to be incredibly important. And the governor has actually mandated that we wear masks. So I think it's an important thing that we can all do. I think hand washing is also going to be key.
What gives you confidence that the masks are what's preventing a greater spread of the virus as opposed to the social distancing measures that are still almost, exclusively in effect?
Spectacular question. I think it's very hard to sort those two things out, but there seems to be evidence of masks working in other populations where it's not just social distancing, but you're right. It's impossible. One of the reasons might be because certain places are just better at social distancing. So that's going to be a really important thing to watch and sort of get a sense of.
So both Scott Lambritis, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your last name, and Bob O'Brien are wondering about the mechanics of how this virus works. Bob asked, has or will COVID-19 mutate and therefore become a moving target for vaccinations?
That's, again, really good question. Something that I've asked my virologist a lot about. Now, viruses do mutate. That's the whole thing behind what Trevor was able to do. Because there's this natural rate of mutation, Trevor, the molecular epidemiologist, genomic epidemiologist, Trevor was able to look at the difference in mutation and determine where the viruses came from and how long ago they came, because there's a pretty constant rate of mutation, okay? Now, one of the questions that's unknown is this issue of, will it mutate so much that will mean that we need a yearly vaccine like we do with influenza? And I don't think we know that yet, to the best of my ability to tell. One of the interesting things, whenever I ask my virologist questions like that, and I ask Trevor and Steve Pergam that question, and Larry Corey and Julie that question a lot, they hedge. And I saw an interesting article today in the Times, I think it was the Times, it might have been the Washington Post or the Seattle Times, that talked about how experts tend to admit uncertainty, okay? Because there's still so much about this virus that we don't know. And I think that keeping an open mind, like most scientists do, incredibly important. And sometimes politicians, decision makers on both the right and the left, both sides, I'm not blaming one side or the other. Sometimes people in political situations are more definitive and think they have all the answers. There's so many answers we don't have right now.
What does this mutation question say about our assumptions around immunity from folks who've already had the virus and recovered from it?
So that's interesting. We saw some interesting data this week from South Korea that suggested that there is immunity to having an infection the first time. And so that was pretty encouraging. We also saw some laboratory data, I believe it was from the Beth Israel in Boston, that showed that you could reduce that having prior infection, development of neutralizing antibodies conferred protection. Okay, now, again, question's not completely answered. I'm not saying that we know for certain, but there seems to be evidence that's reassuring in that right. And now, why is that also important? That's important because it's also going to give us a hint as to how well vaccines might work. Because if you can prevent second infections, then this development of neutralizing antibodies might actually indicate that you have developed immunity. And that's kind of what we're all hoping for.
Got it. Well, Luke Timmerman would like to know how the Fred Hutch might be able to leverage its strength in infectious disease research after the pandemic. I know you've talked about this a little bit in your discussion with Todd, but maybe you could address that a little more directly.
I think it's a great question from Luke. And I think one of the things I said I've been so impressed with is that our virology depth and infectious disease depth is not just based on the COVID epidemic. Our scientists, more than 40 of them, as I mentioned, there were more than 50 who are working on COVID now, but that core group of 40, they were working on viruses a year ago, and they're going to be working on viruses 4 years from now, meaning they've dedicated their lives to being virologists and working on viruses. So I'm very confident that we're going to have people working on viruses. What I'm hoping is we're going to get even more, that we're going to get more young scientists who are now doing their PhDs who think this is what I really want to go into. And so I suspect that this episode might be a stimulus to get more people interested in the field.
I know that the Hutch is known for its education and training programs. So how is the moment that we're in right now affecting those programs and those young scientists and doctors that you mentioned who may be, having their eyes opened to a whole new world?
Well, Monica, that's a terrific question because education training is at the heart of what we do at the Hutch. And we've got several layers of education training. We're doing great at educating our graduate students and postdocs. They're able to come into the laboratories, maybe not actually acutely during COVID, but their education is not going to be completely sidetracked. I think it's a little bit harder for medical students where we have to move to more remote education. That's more at the university than it is at the Hutch. I think one of the places we're most concerned about, because we have a huge commitment to community education and to reaching out into the school systems and having internships where high school students and college students can come into the Hutch, spend a summer learning from our scientists and get turned on into a career in science. That's one of the areas I'm most worried about. And I'd love to be able to see a way to replace that, but it's going to be hard to do that with the current limitations that we have. But we're going to work on thinking, can we come up with alternatives that could be appealing or try to meet that need?
What about your own early career? Are there any lessons from your upbringing or the first few years of your career that you're now taking into the current challenges that you face?
So I think the thing that I guess I would say, that's a great question. I've been an oncologist, medical oncologist. I treated patients for most of my career. I had a big practice of people with lung cancer. And I think one of the things I would say that, and this gets back to something Todd asked about, how do you think about budgets? How do you think about prioritizing things at the Hutch? Okay. I have found whenever I've been in a position where I have a really hard problem and it's not obvious to me what the answer is, I always think to myself, what is in the best interest of a patient? Okay. What's the most important thing we can do for patients at that point? And that tends to be a pretty good guiding principle. Doesn't always make sense, doesn't always apply, but when it can, that same thing I used when I started off at Mass General as a practicing lung cancer doctor and had to make prioritization there, is the same kind of thing I'm thinking about here. Is how can we make sure that we impact the most good, that we move fields forward, that we do things to help COVID, that we do things to help our public health department as well, our public health department at the Hutch, as well as our cancer patients. And I come back to something I said to Todd, patients are counting on us in cancer as well. And that is so important to the cancer patients.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Lynch. I'm going to kick it back over to Todd to wrap things up, but we really appreciate you addressing some of our reader questions.
Great. Thank you, Monica.
So I do have a couple of follow-up questions. By the way, Luke Timmerman, who asked that question, is from the Timmerman Report, fantastic life sciences and biotech reporter. You should definitely check out his site.
Oh, he's fantastic. I agree.
To the point of his question, could the issue of virology be an answer to the funding crunch that you might face? In other words, could this crisis lead to new sources of funding that could fill out some of the gaps that you might see otherwise?
So Todd, we are working every day on raising money for COVID. And so I plan to raise money for COVID to spend on COVID. Okay, meaning we're not looking to raise money for COVID to spend on other things. Okay, meaning it's imperative that we and the community has been extremely generous thus far in the COVID area. And that is a major, major area of fundraising. Since I've been here, I've probably been in more discussions with people about ways they can support COVID than anything else at this point. So yes, that's important. But remember, that's going to support new work in COVID.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you do run. How have you been
slowly?
How have you been personally managing the stress of the situation that all of us have been going through in our own personal lives?
So it struck me today. I did a video for the staff at the Hutch, and I realized that I think it's important to recognize that the last 3 months have not been easy. Okay, it's been hard for everybody. Whether you're in a big house with your family or you're in an apartment like I am by myself. My family's in Connecticut because my son is out of college. My wife's there. Hopefully I'm going to get to see them pretty soon. But it's been hard for everybody. And what's also hard is that we realize it's still early in this process. This isn't going to, next week, this isn't going to be over. It's still the second inning, going back to the baseball sports analogy. We still have a long way to go. I've tried to exercise every day. I think that's important. It also gives me a chance to learn the city, meet the city, see things in Seattle. And I have an apartment that I'm in South Lake Union, but I try to go out to as many different neighborhoods, as many different parts of the city as I can. I wish the city had a few less steep hills, but they're actually good for building endurance. And I have to say, I've been told the Seattle weather is terrible. I have to say, this seems pretty nice to me. We've had a pretty nice weather spring-wise. So I think exercise is important. And then, we're all working really hard. I don't know how you feel in your role, but I feel like I'm working harder than I worked when I was working without all the Zoom calls. The Zoom calls start early in the morning, they go late, and they're on time, they're on schedule. So I think my work has kept me very focused.
Well, we're reaching the end of this Zoom call, but I do want to ask you, is there any message that you would want to leave this audience with, the tech leaders, business leaders, folks from Seattle, whom you may not have had a chance to meet yet because of these circumstances? What message would you want to leave them with?
Well, the message would be just that we've got to have confidence in our mission, confidence in our science, and that this collaborative spirit of Seattle has got to be something that we keep working on, that's going to help give us an edge in getting through this, not just us an edge, but our country an edge in getting through this, and seeing ways that the tech industry can work with healthcare to get us places on testing, on tracing, on tracking, all these kinds of things. If it's not going to happen in Seattle, where is it going to happen? And so that's what I would say that I think is really important for us to be focused on.
Well, Dr. Lynch, thank you very much for spending this time with us.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it.
Dr. Thomas Lynch is the president and director of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. Thanks to everybody who joined us on the webinar and also on the live stream. Just a reminder, you can join us next week at 11 a.m. Thursday, May 28th for a virtual event about building an enduring culture in the era of COVID-19 with Zillow's Rich Barton, Icertis CEO Samir Bodis, and Axiom CEO Elena Dagno. GeekWire members, you can check your email for details. Thanks to everybody for your support. Until next time. Oh, and thanks, Monica. I love having you on here asking these questions. So big thanks to Monica Nicholsberg as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon. We'll talk to you next time.